On the limits of trans enough, authenticating trans identity narratives. The author Spencer Garrison argues that gender identity narratives vary between binary identified respondents and non-binary respondents in the trans community. Garrison interviewed 17 trans-identified respondents, and he was surprised to find that binary-identified trans individuals had more accounts that challenged conventional understanding of gender. Next, we'll discuss trans representation. One prominent figure in media that is a trans person is Laverne Cox. The author argues that it's easier for gender non-conforming Americans to claim identity as a trans person. But what does it mean to be visibly transgender? One, it's a political identity, and two, it's an interpersonal personality identity. This means this identity is distinct from, though dependent upon, existing cultural categories used to organize gender. However, overall, queer identity plays a transgressive and transformative role. How are gender characteristics assigned or attributed? First, let's talk about cultural intelligibility. This occurs when others are unable to determine our gender. We cannot be recognized by them. In essence, we lose our personhood when others cannot see or denote our gender. And this narrative's consistency is needed for others to take the identity seriously. So when we say we have an identity, we must be consistent for others to perceive it as being true. Those persons with the greatest investment in subverting or upending the gender order are perhaps most likely to produce exhausting accounts to affirm it, to justify it, to rationalize it to others. Those who have proven their trans status by accessing medical transition gain a degree of freedom to push back on these stereotypes and are less concerned about validation by others. And so when they look like a consistent status quo image of a particular gender, they have more agency, a perceived agency to push back. Non-binary individuals need to present accounts that closely reflect prevailing understandings of trans experiences, such as the born this way narrative, even when these accounts fail to capture the nuance of their experiences. Non-binary people often experience misidentification, and they often have to rely on dominant accounts of gender to affirm their identity. And there are also social and institutional constraints to identifying and presenting their gender in a certain way. Social and institutional constraints share gender accountability Social and institutional constraints make it socially risky for many non-binary people to center gender deconstruction and their own identity narratives. Those who have already had their identities validated by others are more likely to present ambiguous accounts that center fluidity. How our gender is perceived by others is an interactual accomplishment. Gender is a negotiated social achievement. Gender is an attribution. Gender is reasserted and not achieved. Gender can be undone, although it is difficult. Gender is ubiquitous, it's everywhere. It permeates all of our social interactions and infiltrates all of our institutions. Also, gender defines the situation and manages our presentations of self. Others in our interactions must share the same understanding of reality, including our gender performance. In our assigned category, what fits in the closet matters. We can't opt out of doing gender. Others will assign us to a category anyway. So gender can be undone. Gender hierarchies that undergird our social institutions can be dismantled. And the interactions that shape these support those hierarchies can be redirected. That is the argument of the author. For performances to impact lived reality, others must also be able to recognize them, that they're simply performances. Now on to accountability and identity formation. What is an authentic performance? It's defined by accountability via other enforcement. So someone else perceives and accounts or recognizes your performance as true. There is the policing of performance. Are you doing this gender correctly or not? And of course, self-enforcement. This occurs when actors monitor their own behavior and anticipation of others' reactions. So we're managing our performance of our gender for others. In addition, are we really who we say we are? Do we have to explain others to who we are, what we are, and do we have to explain these things to ourselves? It's all about performance and being accountable to those performances. And maybe this management of self may affect mental health. And this deals directly with authenticity. Am I being real to myself? Do others perceive me as being real? When identity is validated by others, mental health increases. On being trans enough, claiming gender identity by disclaiming affiliation or a category assigned at birth. Why does this even matter? If trans people present an account that seems inconsistent, they face misrecognition at best and stigmatization, exclusion, or violence at worst. Many trans folks express insecurities about whether their identity claims are being perceived as authentic, whether they are trans enough to justify claiming a transgender identity label. And sometimes there is various rationales, a wrong body claim, hormone therapies, sex reassignment, and various ways of managing language or ways they try to authenticate or manage their gender identity. The medical and legal institutions also influence being trans enough. Many times, the trans folks who want a medical intervention have to prove gender dysphoria. And they have to meet providers' expectations to have social recognition as trans. And queer spaces also influence how trans people feel like they are trans enough. Inter-community spaces reproduce dynamics that perpetuate queer marginalization. Tracing the dominant discourse. Often, trans people have to tell the story of when and how they came out. And usually, this is supposed to be a childhood awareness that they're a trans person to be recognized as being real. And so if there's a delay of recognition, this increases doubt. And this reaffirms the born in the wrong body essentialist claim of trans identity. Embodiment matters as well. And this is when we want to bring one's body into alignment with one's identified gender. And so some trans people may change their physical presentation for others to recognize them as a particular gender that they identify with. We also must take into account a trans person's emotional state, because they have to reabsorb back into the binary gender system that may have made them unhappy in the first place. And again, if they're using a medical form to transition, to reaffirm their gender identity, they have to demonstrate mental illness defined as gender dysphoria, and have that gender dysphoria impair their daily functioning. Instead of undoing gender, those who assent identities of trans men or trans women redo gender, retrenching the existing system even as the system adjusts to accommodate them. Here is a quote from one of the interviewees explaining how they are trans enough. I did have to deal with feelings like I wasn't trans enough. Trans people in general already feel like they have to prove themselves, that they're a man enough or a woman enough to be trans. So that's even worse for non-binary people who don't necessarily act manly or girly. Non-binary folks are more anxious about not being trans enough to justify this label publicly. There is skepticism regarding their identity, and it seems to play a verifying role on its own, which leads the person to feel angst rather than affirmations. The language and narratives of trans folks also tell a story. To document that they are not cisgender, non-binary respondents must demonstrate that they displayed gender in incongruent behaviors as children. The only intelligible means of demonstrating this is to document their interests and cross-gender pursuits and behavior while growing up. The author leaves us some space to think about solutions or to make trans experiences better, and they do this by focusing on agency and responsibility. They argue that gender should be deconstructed. However, it should not be centered on the labor of non-binary folks, as they have the largest interactional burden to bear. They have the largest social barriers. And then cisgender people should be tasked with undoing gender, since they are the most privileged in regards to gender.